Hey guys, what's up YouTube? Welcome to Skaleguru. This is my first, uh, technically second but first YouTube channel. So in this channel we're going to be looking into some cool tech stuff with Android, with microprocessors, Snapdragon, your phones and your lives. So how these technologies impact your life and how we can actually learn these technologies and also tweak these technologies. So with today's tutorial is on Android. Basically take an APK and unpack it and look at the code and see what we have got into it. So let's dive into it. So the first thing that you see here is I have my blog page open. I have my blog, it's already written, so you can go into the blog and check on the blog and read the blog for all the installation process and all that stuff. So we'll just look at the other stuff, and let me know if you have any issues with installing and other stuff. Comment below on my YouTube video or in the blog post. I'll reply to that. So let's look into the actual process. So once you get into the so basically the first thing you have to do is download this APK tool, JDGUI and Dex2Jar toolkit. So once you download the toolkit and it's a zip file, you need to extract that. Once you extract the file, you get APK tool, Dex2Jar and JDGUI. These are the three tools that we're going to be looking today. So for the first thing, we're going to look at the APK tool first. So what is APK tool? So APK tool is basically a reverse engineering third-party or closed binary applications. So applications like Instagram, Google, Facebook, or Google Drive, or any other applications of that matter, you can unpack them, look at their code, modify. That's how they do like testing. You can do penetration testing on that, but there are a lot of things that you can do with the unpacked code, and you can easily modify the code and build them back into or modified APKs or modified apps. So, and Dex2Jar is basically a tool that we use to convert the Dex format, that's basically Android's binary format, into Java's .class format. So we'll dig into it a little further. And we have JDGUI, which is basically a GUI program to look at the jar file that we generate from the APK file, so that we are able to look at the code that's in the APK file. Let's get into it. So once you have all these once you have the toolkit downloaded, you just unzip the toolkit and you get all of these files here, all the three folders. You won't get the APK file. I'm just using one of my apps which I developed earlier. So this is going to be easier to look at, and we're going to verify the code that we look at here. Look here in the GitHub repository that I have, and let's look at how good the replication is, or how good the decoding is. So once we get into the tutorial, you need to fire your terminal and move into the CD to the directory that you have the the downloaded files open. Once you move over there, we'll talk about APK tool at the very end, since it's a easier thing. Let's go into the Dex2Jar first. So once you have the Dex2Jar, you kind of go into the Dex2Jar, and there's another file here, folder here, that you need to get into. So once you get into this folder, you're gonna need to take your APK file and paste it over here. So what I'm going to do is these are the old files which I generated. I'm going to trash them out, and you have the same APK file which I already copied earlier. So once you have this APK file here, what we're going to do is we're going to run some simple commands and see how we can unpack this APK. So let's get into it. So we have two different things that we're going to look at today. So that's basically jar to Dex and Dex to jar. So these are the two things that we're going to be looking at. There's batch files and there are shell scripts. So Mac and Windows feel free to use. And once we get into this, we're going to execute the since we already have the APK file. APK is basically treated as a Dex file. So what we're going to do is run the dex to jar. Since we already have the dex, we want to convert it to jar. So we run the dex to jar .sh, and we're going to specify our app name here. So the app is the camera shutter on off, and then we're going to hit enter. It's going to unpack the APK and put it into a jar file. So yeah, so we have the jar file here. So if we look at this file generated here, we have the jar file. Now you need to look at the code that's in this jar file. It's pretty simple to look at this code. You can open up a new terminal or fire up a new terminal or move back. I'm going to open up a new terminal. It's easy to do that. And so once you move back, you're going to go into the JDGUI folder that you have, that we seen earlier. So there's a JDGUI folder here. If you go into the folder, then you have a Linux folder and Mac and Windows. You can install. Windows has a zip file, that's the installation file. Mac and Linux have their own installation files. If you don't want to install the application just for running for one time or just a one-time use, you can just use this jar file and invoke this jar file using the Java program. So that's what we are going to do. It's comfortable, it's easier to do that. So once we get into the JDGUI folder here, and we are going to basically run this jar file. So we're going to do java-jar, then we do a JDGUI jar file. So it's going to take a while to load this file. So once the application opens, it looks like this. So you can directly drag and drop your jar file that you just generated using the dex to jar file. So let's get into the jar. Let's get back into the dex to jar folder, and then you just drag this jar file into this. Boom, and then you have all that stuff in here. So let's just get this a little bigger, and then you have two different packages here. This is the Android support package, which we just use for our basic wrapping up all the libraries and all the UI and stuff. The COM would be your the app that's the package name that's built on. So if you get into COM, you have two different things. I was using a library called Sterickson, which is actually root tools. We'll talk a little later on about routing and stuff. Once you get into this file, you can look, once you get into this package, you can look at the first package here, and there's the main activity.class. If you click on that, you see all the Java code that was written. So the only things that you won't be looking at is, you won't be getting the context, is basically the resource IDs. So basically, once you if you are familiar with Android application development, you use resource IDs to identify your resources in your resource folder, like r.id.logo name or some kind of strings or file name. So those are basically mapped into integers when the program compiles. So you won't be able to reference them back. So if you look at these here, so these are converted into numbers. So these are actually the views that you actually generated on the UI, that you put in on the UI, and you use the resource IDs to identify them. These are the resource identifiers and not the actual UI components. So this is pretty much for the for looking at the code. We'll talk about modifying the code in another tutorial. Let's close this up and let's go back to our dex to jar. Now what we're going to do is basically pack this jar file back into an APK. Yeah, so you can do that. So now what we're going to use is basically jar to dex. That's going to be jar to dex.sh, and then you're going to specify your jar file. That's going to be shutter off on -dex to jar, and you're going to specify the output app name. So I'm going to just name it modified.apk, and -o is for the output parameter, and then you hit enter, and then it's going to compile your jar file into an APK. so it's going to take a while. And then you got the modified APK here. So that's pretty much it for looking into the code. And if you want to do some kind of testing, or if you want to look at the code, and if you want to see where you can find different bugs or different kind of things, where you want to look at all the code and stuff. So now let's get into the APK tool. So why we use APK tool, and why we don't actually use the dex2jar. So since with dex2jar the project is not unpacked completely, so it's just converted into a jar file where you can actually look into the code, but you don't actually have the whole app structure. So to get the whole app structure, you need to use APK tool for that. So so let's get back into the APK tool folder. So once you go into the APK tool folder, you have all the 3 different operating systems, and you can basically install them. Installation is pretty simple. You can look at my blog post for the installation. You just have to drag these files into Windows folder if you're on Windows, or USR local bin folder if you are on Mac, and assign them permissions. Once you have that permissions, you can basically use APK tool anywhere in your whole system environment. So now let's type APK tool. I've already installed APK tool, so you get this APK tool here. So these are all the parameters or the options that we have. So what we are going to do is use the APK tool debug, decompile, and APK tool build options. So since we are still in the dex2jar folder, where we already we have our APK file. So I'm going to move out to our root folder. So I'm going to move out, and then you can see I've moved out. So now we'll use APK tool D for decompile, and then we'll do cam shutter APK. So what this is going to do is basically put up the whole structure, and but you're not going to see the exact code inside the app. I'll talk about what's the exact representation of the Java code that is being translated into smali code. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So once it's done on compiling, or basically decoding, so you get this folder with your app name. I'll fire up Sublime Text quickly to look at this code. So let's drag this up. So once we have this code, you can look at all these different folders that has been generated. Let's look at each one. So original basically has all your manifest files, which is actually the original manifest file which has been generated. That's the binary file, and that binary file is actually extracted into the actual XML file, which you can see here, and you can see all the intents and all the applications and all the permissions that the app has been using, and that's how people find out what permissions which app is been using and which shouldn't have been using in case of a malicious activities in the apps. So you might be familiar with the resource folder. If you are developing any of the Android applications, then you might have seen resource folder where you have all your drawables or your layouts, and you can look at the layout. You can see the whole layout here. You can copy the layouts, and you can build on those layouts. You have all the values, you have the styles that are being written, and you have all the other strings and the public IDs and strings. So this is basically the resource folder, and the code is basically translated once Android builds the APK. It compiles the Java code into the dex code. So that dex code is basically being used as a smali file. So now what you got here in the smali folder is basically represents your Java code, but it's actually not Java. It's the smali file. We'll look into the smali, how to extract, how to recompile this smali file back after modifications and in further tutorials. So I'm going to give you a quick overview. So if you look at all these functions here, so this is how the actual app looks like with the Smiley code. You can't actually modify Smiley. If you are really good at programming or really good at Android programs, you might be familiar, but you might not be able to uh, get a hand into modifying these. So now what we're going to look at is basically once let's say if you modify the Smiley file, and then you got the Smiley file modified, and you added whatever you wanted, and you have it ready for compiling back. So what we're going to do is come back to our terminal, hit APK tool. So APK tool, instead of decompile, that's D, we use B for build, and then we need to specify our folder name here, and then you just press enter, and then that's you're going to see that two different folders being created in the in the directory, and I'm going to talk about a little bit on that. So once you have a build folder that's created, and you have the you'll shortly see a distribution folder. So the build folder here basically has the APK, that's the resources and the dex file that it generates, and the distribution folder will actually have your modified APK, and you can install it on a virtual device, or you can move it to your phone and test it out. So that's a quick overview on how to break the APK and then recompile it back using APK tool or dex2jar, whatever is your comfortable space. You're going to go ahead with that, and we're going to look at into more videos in the further weeks. And so what we are going to look at in our next video is basically when we decompile these files, we got some Smiley files. So what we're going to look at is how to convert these Smiley files into Jasmine files using the dex2jar tool, and then modify that Jasmine file and get it back into our APK, and basically add code or add functionality to our APK without actually having the source code. So that's going to be it for today. Thank you. Like this video, please give it a thumbs up, comment any questions, and share this video and subscribe to Skaleguru.